In the endless sands of North Africa, under a sun that burned with no mercy, the German Afrika Korps once marched with pride. They were Rommel's men, the Desert Fox's warriors, fierce, disciplined, and convinced they were the finest soldiers in the world. But by 1943, that pride had turned into dust. Defeated, exhausted, and surrounded, thousands of German soldiers laid down their weapons to Allied forces. To them, capture by the Americans meant humiliation, maybe even death. They had been told the United States was a land of chaos, a weak, divided nation, full of greed and crime. They were told that Americans hated discipline, hated order, and could never understand sacrifice. But what they found next shattered everything they believed. The prisoners were loaded onto ships, long, silent voyages across the Atlantic. For the first time, they saw the vast ocean of freedom their leaders had warned them about. And when they reached the shores of America, they expected punishment. Instead, they were greeted by something they couldn't understand: kindness. America had no intention to break them with chains. It would break them with something far more powerful: its way of life. The first train stopped in a small Texas town called Mexia. Behind barbed wire, the prisoners expected cruelty. But there were beds, there was food, there were even books and music. Some of them looked at the American guards and whispered, "If this is the enemy, what have we been fighting for?" In those first few days, German soldiers were silent, cautious, afraid. But as the sun set over the Texas plains, something strange began to happen. Laughter, real laughter, echoed through the camp. It wasn't forced. It was the sound of men realizing that life could exist beyond ideology. One of them wrote in his diary, "We are prisoners, yet we are treated here better than soldiers in our own army." That night, beneath the sky filled with foreign stars, they began to question everything they had ever believed about power, freedom, and truth. This was no ordinary war story. It was the beginning of something greater, a quiet revolution of the mind, born not from bombs or bullets, but from decency and the strange power of democracy. When the train stopped in Texas, the prisoners expected barbed wire and darkness. Instead, they stepped into sunlight. Rows of wooden barracks stood against open fields. The air smelled of earth, not smoke. They were given bread, clean water, and cigarettes. For men who had marched through desert storms and starvation, this simple act of humanity felt unreal. One guard offered a smile. Another handed out soap. A few prisoners stared in disbelief. Why would an enemy treat us this way? In Camp Mexia, over 1,800 German soldiers lived behind fences. But within those fences, something unexpected grew: peace. They played football, wrote letters, painted, and built furniture for local towns. Some even started small gardens. American farmers came by, watching them work, surprised by their discipline and politeness. It was hard to hate someone who offered you fresh vegetables in return. Many guards began to forget they were enemies, and the Germans began to see America not as a monster, but as a mirror, a reflection of what their own nation could have been. One letter home read, "If this is defeat, then I wish we had lost sooner." Day by day, America was teaching them a lesson without a single lecture. Its real power wasn't in its soldiers, but in its compassion, its quiet confidence, its freedom. By 1944, the camps had turned into small living towns where enemies became friends and friendship became understanding. It was proof that even in war, humanity could survive. Months passed inside the camps, and the prisoners began to see more than fences. They saw a world that didn't match what they had been told. Back in Germany, propaganda had painted America as a land of chaos, where factories ruled men and money ruled everything else. But from inside those fences, the Germans saw something different. They saw freedom in small things, the way a guard laughed, the way farmers argued openly about politics, the way no one seemed afraid to speak. It confused them. How could a nation so casual, so noisy, so full of contradictions, also be so strong? One prisoner later said, "I was taught that Americans were slaves to machines, but I saw more humanity here than I ever did at home." They worked in cotton fields, factories, and farms. They were paid a few cents for each hour and allowed to buy small luxuries, soap, tobacco, even postcards. Some started sending those postcards home, showing smiling faces and open fields. The censors in Berlin didn't know what to do. The truth was slipping through the cracks. When the local townspeople met the prisoners, they didn't see monsters. They saw young men, some barely 20 years old. Many had never even met an American before. Slowly, invisible lines began to fade. Farmers invited them for coffee. Local children waved at them through the fences. And for the first time, these soldiers, once called enemies of freedom, began to understand what freedom really looked like. It wasn't about power or control or fear. It was about trust. And that, they realized, was something their own leaders never gave them. That realization, that quiet shock, was the beginning of their transformation. As months turned to years, the prisoners began receiving letters from home, thin envelopes carried across oceans, filled with fading ink and silent fear. Germany was changing. Cities were in ruins. Families wrote of hunger, bombs, and broken homes. Inside the Texas camps, those letters felt heavier than chains. The men who once fought with pride now wept in silence, realizing that the world they had left no longer existed. Some refused to believe. Others began to question everything: the war, their leaders, their purpose. But in the middle of sorrow, a small spark of hope appeared. Families surviving, children still waiting. One prisoner wrote, "For the first time, I do not dream of victory. I dream of peace." That thought spread quietly through the camp. Not a revolution of guns, but of hearts. By 1944, something rare had happened. Friendship. Guards and prisoners began to trust one another. It started with small gestures: a cup of coffee, a shared story, a game of chess. The Americans learned that not every German was a monster, and the Germans learned that not every American was an enemy. Music filled the air. On Sundays, guards played guitars while prisoners sang folk songs from home. The fences didn't matter anymore. Many locals even visited, bringing food and photographs. One American officer wrote, "We were told they were our enemies, but when they laughed, I heard no difference from my own brother." The camp became a lesson in humanity. As the war turned against Germany, news of defeat spread through the camps. But something deeper grew: understanding. They had entered as soldiers of tyranny and were leaving as witnesses of freedom. They saw a system that didn't rule by fear, but by choice. They watched Americans argue, disagree, even protest, and yet live side by side. One prisoner said, "Here even the smallest man has a voice. In our world, only the loudest had power." Some began learning English, some dreaming of democracy, not because they were forced to, but because they had lived it. The fences remained, but they no longer felt like walls. They were mirrors, showing them the country they wished Germany could become. When the war finally ended in 1945, the men of Camp Mexia prepared to go home. But home was no longer the same. and neither were they. They packed small boxes, letters, carvings, photographs with guards. They had come as enemies, but were leaving as changed men. The day of departure was quiet, filled with handshakes and silent respect. Some guards saluted them, others couldn't look them in the eye. As the trucks rolled away, one guard whispered, "Go home. Build a better world than the one you left." Many did, rebuilding towns, schools, and communities. Some wrote to their former guards for years, writing, "You taught us freedom, not by war, but by kindness." The world remembers the battles of World War II, but few remember the quiet victories, like the one in a small Texas camp, where enemies learned to be human again.